Okay, good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you all to our public meeting here in Bismarck. I'm Colonel Jeff Van Epps. I'm the commander of the Northwestern Division of the Corps of Engineers, and really appreciate all of you joining us. This is the second of our 7 meetings that we're holding this week from Fort Peck, Montana, where we were this morning, down to St. Louis, Missouri on Thursday morning. I took over command of Northwestern Division of the Corps in July. And I've had some limited engagement with stakeholders throughout the basin, but I'm really looking forward to having a broader and deeper set of discussions, including those that I hope we can have here this evening. You know, it's been 2 years since we had in-person meetings, and a lot of change has changed in that time. In 2019, we were all dealing with near-record floods, extensive runoff, and now we're looking at severe drought, especially in the upper basin. I just want to remind everybody that the Missouri River MAINSTEM reservoir system is designed to serve all 8 of the authorized purposes in both flood years and in drought. And we'll talk more about this when the Missouri River Basin Water Management staff provides additional details on the slides that we'll show here in a second. Before we begin with the technical portion of the meeting, I want to introduce Corps staff in attendance, so let me run through and just provide some introductions. I'll start over here. We've got Mike Swenson and Kevin Grody. Eileen Williamson from Public Affairs. Let's see, I've got John Remus, Ed Clary, Colonel Mark Himes, your local district level commander out of Omaha. We've got Kayla Eckert Upmore from our Chief of Civil Works in the Omaha district. We've got Sheila Newman, our Chief of Operations. In the back there, we've got my XO, Lieutenant Harrison, and then from the Garrison Project, we've got Dave Beck and Chris Silvernagel. So these are all folks who have expertise in various areas that can help answer questions that you might have or address any comments that you have for us as we're going through the evening. Just as a reminder for everyone's safety, we're going to ask all attendees to wear a face mask, and we appreciate cooperation. When you're speaking, just like I have, you're welcome to uncover your face so you can speak more clearly and be more easily understood. And if you want to ask a question or make a comment, you're welcome to come to the front of the room, use the microphone, and address the entire crowd. Any questions before I hand this over to John Remus? No? Okay, great, thanks. I really appreciate it, and John, over to you.
Thank you, Colonel. A little housekeeping here before we get started. Out on the table, there's a copy of the slides you're going to see, and there's a statement card. If you'd like to make a statement, we'd appreciate it if you'd fill one of these things out so we know who made the statement, so we get it right in the notes. So if you want a card or a copy of the slides, just raise your hand and Ed can bring it to you. And then if you fill out the card and want us to pick it up, just hold it up and Ed will collect it for you or from you. We also ask that if you intend to make a statement from a written statement, that you leave us a copy of that statement so we can get it right in the notes. There's a lot of ways to provide comments on our annual operating plan. You can do it here tonight, verbally. You can fill out a comment card that are on the table as well. You can also mail in your comments. We have the address on the table here as well as on our slide, our last slide. Or you can just email it to us. Our email address is also on the last slide of the slide deck. Or you can just Google Missouri River Water Management. We're the top one. Just click on that and you can follow the links to our email. We posted our draft annual operating plan for the 2021-2022 year in late September, and it is open for comment until the 24th of November. When we start, we're going to have a technical presentation by Mike and Kevin here in a few minutes. After that, we'll have the question and answer. We will start with the question and answer period with any congressional representatives or their staff, followed by the folks that filled out the cards, and then we'll open it up to the general audience here. Because we don't have a large staff, usually we ask people to hold their comments or questions to 3 minutes, but because we don't have a huge crowd here tonight, you're welcome to take as long as you need to either ask a question or provide the comment. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Kevin Grody for the technical show.
Thank you, John. So as Colonel Van Apps noted, this is the second of 7 meetings that we're going to be having this week. Another person who's here that we didn't mention was Alan Schlag. Raise your hand, Alan. There you go. Alan is a hydrologist for the National Weather Service office here in Bismarck. The National Weather Service is a treasured partner of the Corps. We communicate with them on an ongoing basis during flood years, drought years, and everything in between. We share information with each other. We go to them when it comes to the climate and weather because they are the experts. And keeping that in mind, this part of the presentation is really something from Kevin Lau, who is a hydrologist with the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center in Pleasantville, Missouri. These are his words. These are their graphics. We are simply just the messenger of those. During the Q&A period, if you have any climate or weather-related sort of questions, we have Alan here to provide that expert response. So with that, let's talk about the weather. So much of the Missouri River Basin has continued to see below normal precipitation over the past 3 months. And you can see that in this graphic. And for those of you, I'm going to point to this one more than the other one. So you can see in this graphic right here is what he's talking about. As well as over the past 6 months, which is in this graphic right here. Many of the areas have received only 25 to 70% of normal precipitation over these time periods. So far in 2021, it has been the 26th driest year on record over the past 127 years of record keeping. So the below normal precipitation has resulted in very dry soils over the basin, as depicted in this graphic right here. It seems to be showing up. Right there. That deep burgundy area in the northeast Montana, for instance, represents the driest 1% of modeled record. The yellow area is ranked in the driest 30%. The lack of moisture has led to 65% of the Missouri River Basin being categorized in some level of drought, and that's shown in this lower graphic right here and in this table. So moving on to the seasonal drought outlook. As we look over the next 3 months, NOAA believes the ongoing drought will persist into 2022 for much of the Missouri River Basin, and you can see that with this deep brown color. That indicates drought persisting. Now, we expect some drought to expand, and that's in these yellow areas in parts of Kansas and Colorado. However, we do see in this light tan color that conditions are likely to improve in parts of Montana. So far in 2021, it's been the 25th warmest year in the Missouri River Basin in 127 years of record keeping. This warmer than normal trend is expected to continue in the western and southern portions of the Missouri Basin for the month of November, and that's shown in these brown colors here. However, you will note that the northern portion of the basin is shaded in white in the upper left-hand graphic. And what he's doing is he's referring to this part here where it says equal chances. And what that means is that climate signals are not strong enough to cause odds to favor above, below, or near normal temperatures. We just don't know. The precipitation trend expected in November is shown in this lower right-hand graphic. So we're talking about this one right here. Again, much of the basin appears in white, meaning that there could be normal, above normal, or below normal precipitation. The climate signals just are not strong enough to allow us to say what is likely to happen. You will note, however, that above normal precipitation is slightly favored during November for Wyoming and Montana. He's talking about this green right here. So looking ahead to the 3-month period of November, December, and January, warmer than normal temperatures are expected to continue in the southern half of the Missouri River Basin, which he's indicating right here in the browns. And just as we saw on the last slide with the 1-month November outlook, climate signals cannot provide a strong indication as temperature trends over the northern half of the basin for the next 3 months. So hence you'll see the white area, which indicates there is just as much chance for warmer than normal as there is for lower than normal or just near normal temperatures through January. So we're talking about this right here, equal chances. And just as we saw with the 1-month November precipitation outlook, the lower right-hand graphic says that for the bulk of the Missouri Basin, we just don't know what precipitation will be over the next 3 months. However, just like in the 1-month November outlook, odds continue to favor above normal precipitation in the northern Rockies over the next 3 months, and this is in keeping with the expectation of La Nina conditions. So he's talking about this right here, for Montana and Wyoming, and then equal chances for the rest of the basin for the next 3 months. So last Thursday, on the 21st of October, NOAA's Climate Prediction Center released its 2021-22 U.S. winter outlook. The URL is shown right here, which is really long. Or you can simply type in U.S. winter climate in your internet search engine. La Nina conditions are expected to return for a second time in a row. No two La Ninas behave the same, but in general, La Nina's leans towards cooler than normal temperatures in the northern portion of the basin and leans towards an above normal snowpack in Montana and Wyoming. A caution here is, though we're saying leans towards, not guaranteed. No two La Ninas are the same, but La Nina typically means for us that it could be cold in the north and favors a good snowpack in the northern Rockies. And here really is the summary of all of that. A very dry and warm year has led to soil moisture deficits and a persistent drought. Warmer than normal temperatures are expected to continue into January for at least the southern half of the basin. We're really not sure what temperature trends will be for the northern half. And while chances in favor of wet winter for the northern Rockies, there is no good signal to indicate precipitation trends for the majority of the basin in the next 3 months. We already talked about the winter outlook. It's on that slide there. And I think the last point Kevin wants to make is that the National Weather Service will issue its spring flood outlooks beginning in February of 2022. So we do appreciate that from Kevin and his group down in the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center. So, as John mentioned, there are 8 authorized purposes to the regulation of the Missouri Basin Water Management Reservoir System. When we make reservoir regulation decisions, we keep in mind flood control, navigation, water supply, hydropower, fish and wildlife, irrigation, recreation, and water quality control. Now we have these 3 on top, flood control, navigation, and water supply. That is not because we like them better than any of the other ones. We like all of them the same. But we put these on top because we make regulation decisions for these 3 primarily, and while doing that, we are serving the other 5 purposes. The other point I want to make here is that when we do make those regulation decisions, we do follow all federal laws. So this graphic does not depict any one of the 6 MAINSTEM reservoirs. It's if you took all 6 of them and put them into one. And we do that purposely because some of the decisions we make are based on how much water is in the system or how much water is in all 6 of the MAINSTEM reservoirs. So there are 4 zones. There's a permanent pool zone, which is the minimum amount of water we need to do to serve some hydropower purposes. And And then we have the carryover multiple use zone. And the way I explain this zone, it's kind of that bank account to get us through long, extended droughts. This exclusive flood control zone is the top zone. And just as the name implies, when we're in that zone, the regulations we make, the regulation decisions we make are based exclusively on flood control. This is the zone we like to be in, 365 days out of the year, the annual flood control and multiple use zone. Ideally, we would start the runoff season, which is on or near March 1st. And then as we saw the plain snow melt and rainfall occur during March and April, we'd slowly rise into this zone. And then as we get into May, June, and July, and the mountain snowpack is melting and the rainfall is occurring, we'd peak somewhere in early to mid-July. And then through the dry months, the fall and winter, we'd slowly meter that water out to serve all the authorized purposes until we start the next runoff season right here at the base. But you can see this is where we're at right now. More than 6 million acre feet into this carryover multiple-use zone, which indicates that we're in drought conditions and water conservation measures are being enacted. So the three components of runoff into the system: the plain snowpack, which melts off in March and April, mountain snowpack, which melts off in May, June, and July, and then during those 5 months, we're also seeing a fair amount of precipitation through the upper basin. We normally see 25% of the annual runoff during those 2 months when the plain snowpack is melting in March and April. We see about 50% during that 3-month period when the mountain snowpack is melting. And then that other 25% comes in the other 7 months. Our forecast, which we updated on October 1st, we updated on the first day of each month. So we'll update this again on November 1 and December 1 and January 1. But our forecast right now is 14.8 million acre feet, which is pretty low. It's a lower decile runoff. And our annual runoff average is 25.8 million acre feet. So this graph really shows where that 14.8 stacks up against the last 123 years of record. You can see this is the lower decile, which means 10% below, 90% above. UD stands for upper decile, UQ stands for upper quartile, so 25% above, 75% below. Mike will talk about those more in his part of the presentation. What I want to point out is the brown areas here, which is the extended droughts that our basin has seen in the last 123 years. So fall and winter releases. Right now, Gavin's Point releases will be reduced to winter rates starting around November 22nd. That is normal. I did say we were in water conservation measures. What that means is that the service level, based on this July 1 system storage check, we reduced the service level, or the amount of water coming out of Gavin's Point to serve navigation, just slightly. But the season length remained a normal 8-month season length. And that means that we will start reducing releases on November 22nd because the 8-month season length will end on December 1st at the mouth. As we always do, we will closely monitor the channel and ice conditions downstream of every one of the projects and downstream of, especially in the lower river. The Gavin's Point releases, again, storage check. It's based on the September 1 storage check. And those are going to be at a minimum rate of 12,000 CFS. And then the expected average releases, and again, this is average monthly releases for Fort Peck, Garrison, and Gavin's Point are laid out here. But one thing I do want to point out is I just got done saying 12,000, and then we put down 12,500. And really what that reflects is during very, very cold periods, what we found is that if we need to increase releases from out of Gavin's Point, just a little bit, and that helps stave off any ice jams. And that usually lasts a few days, maybe a week or so. But that is why we're putting 12,500. Now I'll turn it over to Mike.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. I'm going to continue the presentation by talking about regulation this year and then our regulation into next year and how that will affect the project purpose. purposes. First here, a snapshot of the current reservoir levels. This is similar to Kevin's earlier slide where it shows the storage zones at the different projects. You can see here that Fort Peck is 6.7 feet below the base of the flood control zone. Garrison 6.8 feet, Milwaukee 10 feet below its base of annual flood control zone. Over the next few months, we'll adjust releases at these upper three projects to better balance the storage in those carryover multiple use zones prior to next year's runoff season. Fort Randall is just slightly below its carryover, the base of its flood control zone. That project is typically drawn down in the fall to 1337, and then it's refilled over the winter, and that gives us some extra winter energy generation. So that project will be drawn down and then refilled before next year. So on Kevin's earlier slide, he mentioned those 5 different runoff scenarios from the upper decile to the lower decile. So as part of the draft AOP, we take those 5 different runoff scenarios and we input them into our reservoir models, and then we project out into next year. Those 5 different runoff scenarios give us a range of elevations and releases that we could see next year based on a range of conditions. This slide here then shows the system storage. The black line here is the system storage going back to the beginning of the year. The blue line is the system storage based on the median runoff condition that Kevin talked about. And then we have the lower red line, which is the lower decile, and the upper decile, which is that upper red line. The draft AOP also has the upper and lower quartile runoff scenarios in it if you want to take a look at that for more information. You'll also see on this slide the 3 green triangles, the March, which are the 3 system storage checks. The March 15 storage check sets the navigation service level for the first part of the navigation season. The July 1st storage check sets the navigation service level for the second part of the season, and then also the season length. And then the September 1st storage check sets the Gavin's Point winter release level. So if you go back and look at the black line here, you can see we started the year right where we want to be at the base of the annual flood control zone. However, because the runoff was so low, we really didn't gain much storage this year. Just kind of held it in there, and then it's been dropping ever since. And then you can see, depending on what kind of runoff we get next year, will be very, impacting what kind of storage we have. So under the upper decile, basically a full recovery to the base of the annual flood control zone. The median runoff condition, we do see some recovery of the reservoir system. If we get another dry year with the lower quartile or lower decile type runoff, we'll see continued low reservoir levels going through next year. The next 3 slides here in the presentation and in your handout show the similar sort of plot for the upper 3 projects, Fort Peck, Garrison, and Milwaukee. And I won't go into as much detail on these individual ones, but in your handout for reference. This one's Fort Peck. We'll just stop briefly again on Garrison. Again, you can see similar sort of thing that you saw in system storage. We started the year, right near the base of the annual flood control zone, but the elevation of the reservoirs dropped quite a bit since. And again, depending on what kind of runoff we get next year, that will have a big impact on where Garrison ends up next year. The other thing I'd like to point out on this slide, we'll talk about it a little bit more on the project purpose for fish and wildlife. The reservoir under this lower decile scenario does stay essentially steady or slightly rising during the spring fish spawn period, and I'll reference that again later. And then another slide here for Oahe, similar type of information. So now we'll move on and talk about the individual project purposes. First start with flood control. Flood damages prevented in 2020 was $0.3 billion. Over the next few months, we'll be working up flood damages prevented for 2021. And again, as you saw in our earlier slide, we started the year with all of previous years, which was 2020. Floodwater was evacuated from the reservoir system. So we started right where we wanted to be. And again, we didn't really gain much storage this year due to low runoff. So storage peaked early, March 23rd at 56.3 million acre feet. Just use a small percentage of the total flood storage. Looking out into next year then, again, all scenarios that we've shown start next year below the base of the annual flood control zone. Plus we have some additional storage available in the carryover zone to help with flood control operations. It's still important to note that we can still have flooding downstream due to rainfall events downstream, particularly of the main part of the reservoir system below Gavin's Point. That's due to that large uncontrolled area below Gavin's Point and also the long travel times below Gavin's Point, which can be several days downriver. Next project purpose is hydropower here. Hydropower is largely influenced by the amount of runoff that goes through the system. So you can see here during our last drought period from about 2000 to 2008, system generation was down quite a bit. And then you can see during the wetter recent years, system hydropower is up. With our forecast for this year, we're looking at about 8.9 billion kilowatt hours of energy generation. Next year, with the median runoff condition, we would expect 8.1 billion kilowatt hours. Both of those estimates are less than the long-term average of about 9.5 billion kilowatt hours. Moving on to navigation, we started the 2020 navigation season with full service flows. And when we got to that July 1st storage check, it indicated we need to implement some water conservation measures, so we reduced the service level of flow support by 1,500 CFS. Now looking out into 2020, that first storage check's on March 15th. For median and below runoff, it looks like we'll be on minimum service flow support for navigation. With the upper two runoff conditions, we do show a little bit higher flow support, but it's roughly just about 2,000 CFS higher than minimum service. And then looking out into the next storage check, which is July 1st of 2022, if we get those two wetter conditions, the upper decile and the upper quartile, we show at least full service flow support for navigation. Both those scenarios show a 10-day extension to the navigation season. If we get the median runoff condition, we show some improvement in flow support for navigation. We would go from minimum service flow support up to 2,400 CFS below full service. However, under the two lower scenarios, minimum service and shortened seasons for both those two lower runoff conditions. And in addition, as Kevin sort of alluded to earlier, both these scenarios have shortenings to the navigation season, which we did not have this year, but the lower quartile shows a 7-day shortening, and the lower decile shows a 16-day shortening to navigation flow support. Moving on to water supply, water quality, irrigation, and recreation. These four project purposes all require access to water. In 2021, we started off the year with reservoirs in pretty good shape, so we didn't have any immediate impacts, but as the year progressed and the reservoirs started to drop, we did hear about some impacts, for example, to recreation areas in terms of like boat ramps and things like that. We did hear some issues with the irrigators, for example, below Garrison. We had some calls about irrigation intakes during the summer. Kevin did talk about the Gavin's Point winter releases of 12,000 CFS this coming winter, which could potentially be an issue for some of the downstream water supply intakes. And again, looking on to next year, then really the access issues are very dependent on what kind of runoff we get. You know, again, if we get those wetter conditions, probably some of these issues won't be, or some of these concerns won't be as important. But if we get those lower runoff conditions again, then there might be some access issues for things like water supply intakes, recreation areas, and marinas, and some of those things. And then if we look out to the following winter, the winter of 2022 going into 2023, under the median runoff condition, again, we would have low Gavin's Point winter releases, the minimum level of 12,000 CFS. Referenced Fish and Wildlife earlier. Our goal is to have steady to rising reservoir levels at the upper 3 projects during the spring forage fish spawn. This year, if we don't have sufficient runoff to keep all 3 rising, then we would favor Garrison. And what I mean by favor is we would adjust releases at Fort Peck and Garrison to try to keep Garrison rising during that period. And again, that's in context with other project purposes like irrigation below Fort Peck and Garrison, and also, we have concerns about birds during that time too, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. We'll continue to minimize periods of zero release at Fort Randall to the extent that we can during the nesting season for the birds. This does become a little bit more of a challenge when we get to minimum service type releases because the overall daily averages are lower. And then also during periods of flood risk reduction measures, sometimes we have to quickly cut releases from the projects. And sometimes that just requires us to go to zero out of Fort Randall. And then we'll continue to monitor cold water habitat, and that includes Lake Sakakawea. During the previous drought, we did have some issues with cold water habitat, so we'll monitor that closely as we get into next year. Again, it kind of depends on what kind of runoff we have next year, whether that would be an issue or not. And then last, talk about the regulation for the threatened endangered species. First, the piping plumber and the lease term. In terms of this year, I would mention that the lease term was removed from the endangered species list this year. We'll continue to do an adult census for the terns, but there won't be any additional monitoring of the terns that go on during the nesting season. In terms of the piping plovers, this year the falling reservoir levels did have an impact in terms of more shoreline habitat was available. So that increased the number of fledglings that were produced, and that habitat availability also increased the adult plovers. Looking out to next year, we have a couple of operations that we do during the spring for what will be just the piping plover next year. Gavin's Point releases steady release flow to target. What we mean by that is at the beginning of the nesting season, we would set a steady release from Gavin's Point that would help us meet the targets downstream during that initial part of the nesting season, keep the birds nesting up high during that first phase of nesting. And then if the conditions dry up like they typically do in this later part of the summer, then we would increase flows from Gavin's Point or flow to target. We also have done in the past daily release cycling. That would be 1 day up at the steady release level, followed by 1 or 2 days down at some lower level. And that can be used as a water conservation measure, and it's also been used as a flood risk reduction measure. We haven't really done specifically these operations the last few years. A couple of years it was just due to the high runoff and we were evacuating water. Last year we had an initials requirement downstream to meet the targets that was somewhat higher than the normal steady release would be. So we'll just have to see how it plays out. These will be based on nesting habitat availability next year and also hydrologic conditions at the time. We'll continue to do intraday peaking patterns at Garrison and Fort Randall. These intraday or hourly peaking patterns give us some hydropower benefits. but they also give us consistent river stages on the sandbars below Garrison and Fort Randall where the piping plovers are nesting. And then we'll continue to do measures to minimize take. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the regulation for the pallet sturgeon. The Fort Peck Dam test release final EIS was issued in September. The record of decision is not signed yet. The comment period for that final EIS closes, I actually think, today. And the record of decision will follow at some point, probably in November. The EIS identifies and compares alternative test releases from Fort Peck, and the purpose of the test flows is to evaluate the potential for achieving pallet sturgeon spawning and recruitment on the upper Missouri River. At this point, according to the criteria that's in the EIS for those test flows are unlikely in 2020. And that's mainly due to the current low reservoir level, and also, the elevation is likely to be below the Fort Peck spillway crest, so that would impact the ability to run any tests next year. So in summary, again, water conservation measures were enacted on July 1st. We start next year with all of the flood storage available, plus some additional flood storage in the carryover zone. We'll closely monitor the mountain and plain snowpack this winter, and also the river conditions below the reservoir system and also between the reservoirs during the winter. And then the service level for the 2020 navigation season will likely be below full service. At this point, it kind of looks like it's going to be minimum service to start the season.